Before we begin, I want to go over two things briefly. One not really related to this video, the other one is. It's unlikely you don't know this, but the Gaza Strip has been the target of intense and never-ending assaults from the Israeli government and the IDF tantamount to genocide. These crimes designated as serious enough that the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant do not appear to have any stopping in sight. Now, sadly, there is not a lot we can do unless somebody watching this happens to be a key figure on the world stage. In that case, why the fuck are you? Go. Do something. For the vast majority of people, however, we are not completely without power, at least in a way that we can help the Palestinian people. Linked below is the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund. If you can donate, please do. If not, and that is completely understandable, there are other ways you can raise awareness, such as following the Boycott, Divestment, Sanction campaign. Also, information to that will be linked below. If you use this preamble for a reason to spread anti-Semitic nonsense, please be aware you are not helpful, you are not an ally to the people of Gaza, you are using their suffering to be a bigot, get fucked. Also, try challenging me on what I just said. I'm sure to respond. For everyone who can be normal, every little thing we can do can help. Second point of this video, I am not a woman. This video is about women's representation and how that has evolved over time. Just to give a brief thing without going into too much detail, because that's the video's job. I am talking about something that I have a complete outsider perspective on. I did have women look over large chunks of my script, and thanks to them for doing that. But bear in mind, my larger point here is that everyone should be doing better on this regard. I include myself in this. If you see female creators talking about similar subjects like this, I would highly advise you take what they say under deeper consideration, as they will have more lived experiences than I do, and they can bring more to the table in that regard. If I've just convinced you to stop watching, oh well. Walked myself into that one, I guess. For everyone else, let us continue. On January 6, 2021, a rally was held in Washington, D.C. This was the result of months, some would say years, long campaign to cast doubt on the former US President Donald Trump losing the 2020 election, perpetuating the idea of voter fraud. This mostly targeted mail-in ballots, which are slower to count, which gave the impression that during the November count, Trump was in the head of the states, such as Pennsylvania, until mail-ins secured Biden's victory. Pew Research backed up the idea that Biden supporters were more likely to vote by mail. Many of these citing COVID as a reason for doing this, which Trump's faction was more likely to dismiss. But most of them, it was just voting patterns based on years that they didn't buy into this demonizing of mail-in ballots being fraud. Whatever the reason, a narrative was spun on this belief. This election was stolen by the Democrats. This in spite of the fact that several lawsuits were filed over the belief of the election fraud, and none of them have been won. No evidence of voter fraud at the level Trump and his team were claiming has ever been found. But don't let that get in the way of a good yarn. I won't bore you on the details of how terrible the US's process for electing their president is. I will say that Biden's win was legally binding. I'd never say the US president elections were democratic, but January 6th was a last-ditch effort. Outgoing Vice President Mike Pence was overseeing Congress certifying the Electoral College's decision on president. This is a pretty routine part of the whole thing. The college voted in December, Biden was going to be president. What Trump supporters wanted Pence to do ostensibly was to break law, or in this case not abide by the US Constitution, by refusing to certify their position and push for it to the House of Representatives on this bullshit made up precedent. A lot of pressure was put on Pence to toe the line, even though everybody except for maybe Trump diehards knew it was a fruitless endeavor. But they protested on January 6th anyway. And this was their right, even on made-up horseshit. As you well know, however, this isn't how things stayed. Trump galvanized the crowd by telling them to fight like hell, reasserting the stolen election narrative. The crowd of thousands with far-right extremist groups set their sights on the Capitol, and the march eventually turned into a riot. Many who broached the Capitol were armed. Pence had to be escorted out, and many Congress people had to hide from the oncoming mob. It took law enforcement hours to regain control, and thousands have been indicted over the next few years. 5 people were killed. That's not important. Who cares about that? I'll tell you what we really need to worry about. They fucking cancelled Pepe Le Pew. Except he wasn't. He was removed from one scene of the Space Jam sequel, which as far as I could tell was more due to the gag not really working. The scene in question was lampshading the less than stellar sexually aggressive reputation the character had built over the years. The same people using it as political, mad, gone correctness would have probably hated it. He has appeared since, and people have made fun of how, improper his characterization has been for fucking decades. If you actually watch the other big screen Looney Tunes films, he's barely in any of them. He's not that popular a character until people decided their favorite childhood rapist had been unpersoned, which I guess is difficult to do for a fucking cartoon. Also, the scene sounds like it sucked, which, I mean, probably meant it would have fit perfectly with the movie. But wait! Never mind that! Mr. Potato Head is gender neutral now! Actually, yeah, no, he isn't. He's part of a Potato Head family, and they're just rebranding the whole thing to be Potato Head, because it's like confusing for it to be like him being Mr. Potato Head and the brand itself being Mr. Potato Head, encompassing the rest of the potato heads. I mean, they tried to argue that that wasn't it. They were trying to be more inclusive, but that's probably the actual reason. Frankly, brand synergy. Also, this is how I found out that Mr. Potato Heads were like still being made. I just figured they were just a Toy Story character at this point. But wait! Never mind that! They'll no longer be publishing Dr. Seuss books! All those beloved children's classics like Horton Hears a Who, How the Grinch Stole Christmas, Horton Hears a Who, How the Grinch Stole Christmas, The Cat in the Hat, they're fine. It's 6 books that aren't really that popular because they couldn't really get over the racially charged illustrations that pop in the book. So instead of trying to remove them and just basically gutting those books, they're just not being republished. I need to stress, republished. They're not being like burnt in a fucking pyre or something. You could probably go to a library and find them if you care that much, and there's probably still copies of more recent publications like lying around somewhere. But we've kept the worst for last. The creme de la creme of wokesters not doing anything really. Lola Bunny is no longer hot. Stay with me now. I know you need time to recover from this. This is another Space Jam 2 one, which, man, that film got a shafting from the shitheads. This is when stills were released from the film revealing Lola Bunny's new design, and people were not happy about it. Now, there are certainly people who posit that the backlash to Lola's new design was more due to, like, it being a terrible aesthetic, and not really that the hypersexualization of the 90s counterpart was toned down.
Alright, everybody sit down, I'm gonna say it. Lola Bunny, she looks like shit, she looks like garbage, she looks awful. And this has nothing to do with her tits because I don't even like tits. Now, I totally understand the criticisms against sexualizing Lola Bunny in the original film, but why did you have to make her face ugly? Lola Bunny looks like shit in the same way that the original Sonic trailer looked like shit. Criticizing a character's aesthetic appeal is not the same as wishing she was more sexualized. But the first articles that came out about this movie were talking about how they desexualized Lola Bunny, and those got a bunch of clicks and people started arguing about it, so now it's impossible to have a conversation about the aesthetics of the character without making it seem like you want to sexualize her. She looks like shit!
And like, that's fair. I don't really have much stock in her redesign, if I'm being honest, but it really doesn't help when they were sharing around images to prove that the old design looked better. People were sharing an image from a porn parody, not the actual film. And I need to stress this now. I don't care. I'm not going to go back and forth and dig up some 3-year-old tweets to show people mauling over their bunny waifu, and I don't care about Pepe Le Pew not being in the film either, or the Potato Heads, or Dr. Seuss books, or Lola Bunny's tits. I don't really care about Space Jam 2. I'm intentionally not using the title because I don't care. The movie sucks ass, I'm not here to defend it. Hate the design, love the design, I don't care, I don't care, I don't care. But what struck me was none of that stupid shit. It was something director Malcolm D. Lee said when discussing Lola's looks.
This is 2021. It's important to reflect the authenticity of strong, capable female characters. She probably has the most human characteristics of the tunes. She doesn't have a thing like a carrot or a lisp or a stutter. So we reworked a lot of things. Not only her look, like making sure she had an appropriate length on her shorts and was feminine without being objectified, but gave her a real voice. For us, it was, let's ground her athletic prowess, her leadership skills, and make her as full a character as the others.
And that bothers me. It clearly bothered me in a way I haven't been able to shake it off for like 3 years now. Because it's yet another example of a male-dominated industry telling us what's best for a woman to be in the industry. And like, no, I don't mean Lee any ill intent here. I don't even necessarily think he's wrong precisely. But it's yet another overcorrection towards a specific push to make female characters better and reflect the social norms in a way that feels more dictating than leading. So I want to explore Lola Bunny, how she developed over the years, and less importantly, what that says about how women are depicted and characterized by media. I'm sure this will be a fun one. Lola came from a desire to have a female Looney Tune in the mix for Space Jam. The original pitch was to take an obscure character from other Looney Tunes cartoons, Honey Bunny, and just reintroduce her to a bigger audience. However, Honey proved to be too similar to Bugs in design, so they ended up just kind of redesigning her until she was absolutely nothing like the character, and eventually they just named her Lola after going through different iterations. Pretty humbling origins if I don't say so myself, but why is there a need to unsausage the Looney Tunes to begin with? Let's take a look at the Smurfette principle. The Smurfette principle was a term coined by feminist essayist and poet Cata Pollitt for a 90s article in the New York Times. The gist of it is to call out the benign sexist trend of having just one female character in children's entertainment that her daughter was watching. Basically, most of the shows she was growing up with would have like one female character, the Smurfette, if you will, in a sea of otherwise men, and she takes a usually nurturing or passive role in the narrative. The essay itself is great, and I actually do recommend reading it. It's not particularly long either. It goes into a plethora of other issues. But I want to highlight Pollitt using why women are still in this position by the time of this essay's publication about 30 years ago.
How can it be that 25 years of feminist social change have made so little impression on preschool culture? Molly, now 6 and well aware that women can be doctors, has one theory. Children's entertainment is mostly made by men. That's true, as it happens, and I'm sure it explains a lot. It's also true that, as a society, we don't seem to care much what goes on with kids, as long as they're reasonably quiet. Marshmallow cereal, junky toys, endless hours in front of the tube. A society that accepts all that is not going to get in a lather about a little gender stereotyping. It's easier to focus on the bright side. I had Cinderella, Sophie has The Little Mermaid. That's progress, isn't it? We're working on it, Dulcie Singer, the executive producer of Sesame Street, told me when I raised this sensitive question of those all-male Muppets. After all, the show has only been on the air for a quarter of a century. These things take time.
And yeah, it's worth considering that factor. No matter what progress is being made here, it's men in charge of these decisions. It's pointing at the EP on Sesame Street that Paula talked to was a woman. Spoiler, twist, shock, wow. Even on that high a level, the mostly is what really hurts the slow push towards progress here. And especially pointing that something I feel is still somewhat unexamined is children being hit at a young age by the societal norms, because nobody seems to think what products we share to our youth are something we should put this kind of thought and care into examining. While there's not really any reason I can find why these characters keep being unadded to these mostly male casts, I think it works as a push-pull of feminist autonomy and their voices being heard over the 70s and 80s. Combined with societal reticence towards more sexualized depictions and ongoing conversations about sexual harassment during that period. These dynamics and social focuses will and have changed as more feminine voices have taken refuge in front of and behind the camera. And their contributions and effect to media should not be ignored, of course. However, it's not without reason that the male writers wanted to keep up the female representation in their work, without wanting to be accused of being too sexist with their media depictions, and the result ended up being, well, a little bland and on the wayside compared to the male heroes. These Smurfettes are still byproducts of a mostly male-dominated culture, and while some of them have certainly stood out, there's no accounting for good writing, of course, their voices just did not matter or have as great an impact on these stories told to us all. And then, the 90s.
Let's go, girls.
This period brought along third-wave feminism, which pushed to subvert the ideas of roles and the idea of postmodernism by examining the power of sexist symbology with an emphasis on diversifying the voices of conversations that were being had. While this was more on the academic side, on the pop culture side we have arguably the most important act of 90s feminist pop culture, the Spice Girls. Yeah! Their origins have rooted in the riot girl punk movement of the early 90s, but again, it was manufactured and brought together by men, by patriarchal influence. While the band members themselves have contributed to the feminist image, it was shaved and sanitized for all your viewing pleasure. And we got what was the 90s empowered women, so to speak, Loud, abrasive, in your face, uncompromisingly proud of themselves, and a place that they will forge themselves in this male dominated world. And hell, at least the girls had control over their image. Most shit from TV was still largely dominated by men. And we got stronger female characters that are even the centers of their own shows, like Buffy and Xena. But they had a tendency to be framed more through male desires and their own skewed understanding of feminist morals than actually achieving the perceived desires of feminism. Not to say that these shows aren't good and can't get these kind of feminist issues right, and to claim that there's like no female writers on either shows would just be hardcore rager, but still, male focused. And these tropes of kick-ass no-nonsense women seeped into other creative avenues at the time. And now they found a way to characterizing Lola Bunny in a much less thoughtful way. She's tough, she's cool, she's in charge. She says don't call her a degrading pet name.
Don't ever call me doll.
Don't call me babe.
And yet, the jokes are mostly about all the male characters ogling her. All about them fantasizing about her. That's her character. I'm sorry if I'm shitting on your furry awakening, but she is a textbook example of how to write a strong female character from a male perspective and also with one hand. Television kept on redefining femininity into the 2000s with popular shows such as Ally McBeal and Sex and the City. However, they also came under critique for upholding beauty standards as well as being very focused on the idea of rich white women being the center of the feminine ideal. However, the biggest influence on comedies, at least for a few decades following its airing and completion, was not single female lawyers and women belayed in shopping. I'm sorry to Sex and the City fans, I've never watched the show. And arguably even how women were depicted in especially situational comedies. It was Friends. If I need to tell you about Friends, I doubt you're this far into a video essay analysing television trends. For our purposes, some of the biggest influences Friends did was not only making the cast more communal as opposed to being familial or workplace in their setting, but actively dividing the gender parity in the focal characters.
Before Friends, other comedy shows that focused on friendship groups were usually about people of the same gender. For example, Happy Days was mostly about a gang of guys, squeezing in the occasional love interest or sister. Golden Girls, which aired from 1985 to 1992, was about 4 older women living together in Florida. By creating a mixed gender group that included platonic friendships, Friends had the chance to play around with a different set of dynamics. There was leeway to experiment with various pairs and trios. This is how we ended up with Phoebe, Lisa Kudrow, and Joey, arguably the most entertaining duo, and with Monica and Chandler's romance. But there was also space for the 3 men to do manly friendship things, and for the women to do girly friendship things. The show proved that the more gender diverse the group, the more varied the relationships and opportunities for comedy.
And we will see this example of gender parity throughout the era, including into the 2010s, one of my favourite examples being subversive sitcom Community. Here's also where we land on Lola's next big development, the Looney Tunes show. The 2011 show marked a striking difference compared to how other Looney Tunes cartoons were presented. They actually put it into a sitcom format.
We've been developing this show for a long time. It was a sketch comedy show for a while before we finally found this format and went, well, this is the best way for us to explore these characters, Tony Schiavone said. Spike Bandage, Schiavone's production partner, elaborated, saying that the sitcom format allowed viewers to become invested in Bugs and Daffy in a way they could not with the original Looney Tunes shorts. We wanted to do something where the audience eventually cared about the characters, and it seemed like the sitcom format was the best way to do that. It was a way to have ongoing characters where you are learning something new about them over the course of the show.
Given how Friends' structure got a lot of great comedic potential out of the cast, that appears to have been on the producers' minds when they decided on this format. While she had appeared in other Looney Tunes properties throughout the years, this one marked a massive change in Lola's character. A lot of this was down to Kristen Wiig's performance. Adding to that development, she was reimagined as Bugs' ditzy, flighty girlfriend. Once again, Lola is here to fit a role. Previously, she was a strong, independent, takes-no-shit, 90s feminist figure that still was allowed to be a figure to be ogled. Over a decade and a half later, we get a character minimized into her role of a girl. And this is once again to round out the mostly male cast. Except this time in the sitcom format where she can play a role to serve as comedic potential. Whenever Lola is introduced or reintroduced, she's not as well defined a character as, say, Bugs or Daffy or Porky. She is a role that has to be defined by outside cultural circumstances. And yes, I hear all you fuckers already jumping to conclusions about what I'm saying about this version of the character. I will get back to this. Crucify me later if that doesn't suit your whims. This brings us finally, nearly a decade later, to the current Lola. Back to Space Jam Lola. What's changed? Inarguably, the biggest change in feminist discourse is the Me Too movement, and in terms of the entertainment industry especially, the arrests and convictions of Harvey Weinstein and Bill Cosby. This definitely signaled a change in how women and other marginalised voices are perceived and depicted on screen, with a lot more thought needed. Yet this doesn't appear to have happened when looking at the hard stats. In fact, in some ways, the rate of representation has actually gone down. Another study in this vein was conducted by communications professor Stacey L. Smith, who studied movies from 2007 to 2022, and outside of the surprising spike in Asian representation, which is great, progress is not really as there as the anti-woke brigade mauling over boobs in Star Wars would have you believe. Smith actually makes this rather astute observation.
It's all talk and little action. Many of these numbers did not move or went backwards. That shows us that the industry does not know how to change without the intervention of experts to work with them to change the systematic processes that lead to inequality and discrimination.
I made a video a while back looking into the Me Too movement, amongst other things, and the observation is that people seem to be putting on an appearance of pretending these systemic problems have been changed, rather than putting work into actually changing them. In other words, they're overcompensating and even causing the women they're trying to uplift to be marginalized in order to do it. Part of that is nowhere near the push for women behind the scenes, but for our purposes, it means giving us female characters that appear to be #girlbossing their way into better representation, instead of doing anything compelling, three-dimensional, or, well, helping audiences see women as complex, dynamic humans in their own right. And that's where new Lola falls in. I don't like her depiction in the first Space Jam. It's as flat as a conspiracy theorist topography conclusions. But she at least has something that made people remember her. Do you remember Space Jam 2, Lola? If you even saw the movie? Because I did, because of fucking course I did. And I could easily be convinced that she isn't actually in the movie with how little impact she makes. And yeah, fuck it, that's reflected in her design. There's just not a lot of personality there. If you found the design weak and weren't fucking weird about it, like, I get it. Having seen the movie, it's super hard to defend as long as it's not people being normal about cartoon Bunny allegedly got a breast reduction. And that's where we're at with Lola. She appears in Tiny Toons University, and she's still on that kind of girl boss kind of image, but it's played more strictly for laughs, and she's got this cool, chill kind of surfer vibe. I like it, it's fun, it's a good show. But we see the problem here, right? Lola's almost reflective of whatever cultural and media development is happening and how women are treated and represented both on screen and off. And while I came down on Malcolm D. Lee earlier for this, I sincerely don't think this was anything other than his best intentions. I don't think he strives to make Lola boring. I think this is a larger issue. So let us go further into our discussion about Rabbit Woman by bringing in one of the foundational texts of modern day feminist discourse. It's what the Beauvoir would have wanted. The second sex is a foundational feminist text written by Simone de Beauvoir and published in the 1940s. It is, for lack of better description, a densely methodical and deeply acerbic analysis about how the ideas of womanhood and the feminine form were constructed. To try to sum up this massive tome and the confines of an essay about Hot Bunny is kind of absurd, and to be clear, I'm not going to do a massive deep dive into this book, but I will say especially the first half of it is about how women were defined as a form and a being separated from men and humanity as a whole. They are othered in psychoanalytical and historical confines as well as biological.
As Merleau-Ponty rightly said, man is not a natural species, he is a historical idea. Woman is not a fixed reality, but a becoming. She has to be compared with man in her becoming. That is, her possibilities have to be defined. What skews the issue so much is that she is being reduced to what she was, to what she is today, while the question concerns her capacities. The fact is that her capacities manifest themselves clearly only when they have been realized. But the fact is also that when one considers a being who is transcendent and surpassing, it is never possible to close the books. However, one might say, in the position I adopt, that of Heidegger, Sartre, and Merleau-Ponty, that if the body is not a thing, it is a situation. It is our grasp on the world and the outline for our projects.
I don't believe it's so much the case that she thinks that women's autonomy and entire states of being and existing is controlled by men, but more a patriarchal force that adheres these ridiculous standards that women feel the need to live by. They are not humans with their own unique identities, thoughts, and aspirations in the same way that men are.
Humanity is male, and man defines woman, not in herself, but in relation to himself. She is not considered an autonomous being. Woman, the relative being, writes Michelet. Thus, Monsieur Benda declares in La Rapport d'Uriel, Uriel's report, a man's body has meaning by itself, disregarding the body of the woman, whereas the woman's body seems devoid of meaning without reference to the male. Man thinks of himself without woman. Woman does not think of herself without man. And she is nothing other than what man decides. She is thus called the sex, meaning that the male sees her essentially as a sexed being. For him, she is sex, so she is it in the absolute. She is determined and differentiated in relation to man, while he is not in relation to her. She is the essential in front of the essential. He is the subject, he is the absolute. She is the other.
Why were women ordered like this? It's really hard to say, and it's actually a hotly debated point about women's role in society and how that evolved. Believe it or not, history is not as objective as you want to imagine it is, and it is hotly debated. And prehistoric civilizations didn't really write shit down. But it's believed that women used to be the center of familial structures, as they were broken down into more of a polyandry communal family, and mothers, well, the mother was the parent to the children. These concepts were explored a lot, but in particularly by Friedrich Engels of Marx and Engels fame when he had a solo career.
The following is a pretty distinct breakdown. It's from the preface of a re-release of Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, where Engels goes over the beliefs on the theory of Swiss anthropologist Johann Jakob Bachofen in a numbered list which the internet loves. Bachofen's thoughts were broken down as thus.
That originally man lived in a state of sexual promiscuity, to describe which Bachofen uses the mistaken term heterism. That such promiscuity excludes any certainty of paternity, and that descent could therefore be reckoned only in the female line, according to Mother Right, and that this was originally the case amongst all the peoples of antiquity. That since women, as mothers, were the only parents of the younger generation that were known with certainty, they held a position of such high respect and honor that it became the foundation, in Bachofen's conception, of a regular rule of women, gynecocracy. That the transition to monogamy, where the women belonged to one man exclusively, involved a violation of a primitive religious law, that is actually a violation of the traditional right of the other men to this woman, and that in order to expiate this violation or to purchase indulgence for it, the woman had to surrender herself for a limited period.
The rise of polyamory falling out in favor of monogamy, leading to women being considered ostensibly properties of their husbands, again, hard to distinctly ascertain, but Engels posits it's related to how much industry and metallurgy eras evolved into private property ownership. These labour-intensive fields of wealth, favouring them as men traditionally were the ones who went out working, meant they were more likely to push to take charge, thus leading to inheritance falling to men. This means marriage is fading from what Engels coins as pairing families, which were more open but had a set husband and wife, to something more familiar to modern monogamous marriages. Monogamous marriages. Try saying that 20 times fast.
The development of the family, then, is founded on the continual contraction of the circle, originally comprising the whole tribe, within which marital intercourse between both sexes was general, by the continual exclusion, first of near, then of ever remoter relatives, including, finally, even those who were simply related legally. All group marriage becomes practically impossible. At last, only one couple, temporarily and loosely united, remains. That molecule, the dissolution of which absolutely puts an end to marriage. Even from this, we may infer how little the sexual love of the individual in the modern sense of the word had to do with the origin of monogamy. The practice of all nations of that stage still more proves this. While in the previous form of the family, the men were never embarrassed for women, but rather had more than enough of them. Women now became scarce and were sought after. With the pairing family, therefore, the abduction and barter of women began, widespread symptoms, and nothing but that, of a new and much more profound change. The pairing family, being too weak and too unstable to make an independent household necessary or even desirable, in no way dissolves the traditional communistic way of housekeeping. But household communism implies supremacy of women in the house as surely as exclusive recognition of a natural mother and the consequent impossibility of identifying the natural father signify high esteem for women, i.e., mothers. It is one of the most absurd notions derived from 18th century Enlightenment that in the beginning of society, woman was the slave of man. Among all savages and barbarians of the lower and middle stages, sometimes even of the higher stage, women not only have freedom, but are held in high esteem.
Just interjecting slightly, if you haven't read Engels' text here, savage and barbarian generally refer to cultural stages, how humans evolved through prehistoric times. It's not towards one specific grouping. Obviously, not all of it has aged amazingly well. There is going to be a lot of weird racial shit if you read it. I do recommend going into the text for fuller context. I'll be linked in full.
The more in the course of economic development, undermining the old communism and increasing the density of population, the traditional sexual relations lost their innocent character suited to the primitive forest, the more debasing and oppressive they naturally appeared to women, and the more they consequently longed for relief by the way of chastity, of temporary or permanent marriage with one man. This progress could not be due to men for the simple reason that they never, even to this day, had the least intention of renouncing the pleasures of actual group marriage. Not until the women had accomplished the transition to the pairing family could the men introduce strict monogamy, true only for women. The human labor at this stage does not yet produce a considerable amount over and above its cost of subsistence. But the introduction of cattle raising, metal industry, weaving, and finally agriculture wrought a change. Just as the once easily obtainable wives now had an exchange value and were bought, so labor power was now procured, especially since the flocks had definitely become private property. According to the social custom of that time, the man was also the owner of the new source of existence, the cattle, and later on of the new labor power, the slaves. But according to the same custom, his children could not inherit his property, for the following reasons. By maternal law, i.e., while descent was traced only along the female line, and by the original custom of inheriting in the gens, the genteel relatives inherited the property of their deceased genteel relative. The wealth had to remain in the gens. In view of the insignificance of the objects, the property may have gone, in practice, to the closest genteel relatives, i.e., the consanguine relatives on the mother's side. The children of the dead man, however, did not belong to his gens, but to that of their mother. They inherited first together with the other consanguine relatives of the mother, later on perhaps in preference to the others. But they could not inherit from their father, because they did not belong to his gens, where his property had to remain. Hence, after the death of a cattle owner, the cattle would fall to his brothers, sisters, and children of his sisters, or to the offspring of the sisters of his mother. His own children were disinherited. In the measure of the increasing wealth, man's position in the family became superior to that of woman, and the desire arose to use this forfeited position for the purpose of overthrowing the traditional law of inheritance in favor of his children. But this was not feasible as long as maternal law was valid. This law had to be abolished, and it was. This was by no means as difficult as it appears to us today. For this revolution, one of the most radical ever experienced by humanity, did not have to touch a single living member of the gens. All its members could remain what they had always been. The simple resolution was sufficient, that henceforth the offspring of the male members should belong to the gens, while the children of the female members should be excluded by transferring them to the gens of their father. This abolished the tracing of descent by female lineage and the maternal right of inheritance, and instituted descent by male lineage and the paternal right of inheritance.
So as you can see, Engels posited it was the evolution of property rights that helped mold the matriarch's place in the family to be away from the central role she once played. Essentially, in a lot of ways, she was equal to the man's role in that regard, as the man in this case did the labour and owned the land. As simple as that was in the time, at least according to Engels, it would be something that evolved into unquestioned gender roles as history rolled on. Of course, people disagreed with Engels on this position. Kind of importantly for this discussion, one of these critics was de Beauvoir.
Although the synthesis outlined by Engels marks an advance over those we have already examined, it is still disappointing. The most serious problems are dodged. The whole account pivots around the transition from a communitarian regime to one of private property. There is absolutely no indication of how it was able to occur. Ingalls even admits that, for now, we know nothing about it. Not only is he unaware of its historical details, but he offers no interpretation of it. Similarly, it is unclear if private property necessarily led to the enslavement of women. Historical materialism takes for granted facts it should explain. It posits the interest that attaches man to property without discussing it. But where does this interest, the source of social institutions, have its own source? This is why Ingalls' account remains superficial, and the truth he uncovers appear contingent. It is impossible to go deeper into them without going beyond historical materialism. Similarly, it is impossible to deduce woman's oppression from private property. Here again, the shortcomings of Ingalls' point of view are obvious. While he clearly understood that woman's muscular weakness was a concrete inferiority only in relation to bronze and iron tools, he failed to see that limits to her work capacity constituted in themselves a concrete disadvantage only from a certain perspective. Because man is transcendence and ambition, he projects new demands with each new tool. After having invented bronze instruments, he was no longer satisfied with developing gardens, and wanted instead to clear and cultivate vast fields. This will did not spring from bronze itself. Woman's powerlessness brought about her ruin because man apprehended her through a project of enrichment and expansion, and this project is still not enough to explain her oppression. The division of labor by sex might have been a friendly association. So we reject Freud's sexual monism and Ingalls' economic monism for the same reason. A psychoanalyst will interpret all woman's social claims as a phenomenon of masculine protest. For the Marxist, on the other hand, her sexuality only expresses her economic situation in a rather complex roundabout way. But the categories clitoral and vaginal, like the categories bourgeois and proletarian, are equally inadequate to encompass a concrete woman. Underlying the personal emotional conflicts as well as the economic history of humanity, there is an existential infrastructure that alone makes it possible to understand in its unity the unique form that is a life. Freudianism's value derives from the fact that the existent is a body. The way he experiences himself as a body in the presence of other bodies concretely translates his existential situation. Likewise, what is true in the Marxist thesis is that the existence ontological claims take on a concrete form based on the material possibilities offered to him, particularly based on those that technology opens to him. But if they are not incorporated into the whole of human reality, sexuality and technology of themselves will fail to explain anything.
And yes, it is a facile analysis of femininity and what it meant throughout humankind, reducing womanhood to labour without taking in the whole of the experience of what it meant in a broader culture. No matter the truth of the matter, it shows a complex, multifaceted issue that won't be broken by simply freeing the proletariat. It needs to break down certain held truisms as myth.
The asymmetry of the two categories, male and female, can be seen in the unilateral constitution of sexual myths. Woman is sometimes designated as sex. It is she who is the flesh, its delights and its dangers. That for woman it is man who is sexed and carnal is a truth that has never been proclaimed because there is no one to proclaim it. The representation of the world as the world itself is the work of men. They describe it from a point of view that is their own, and that they confound with the absolute truth.
So men, in this case let's just round it up to be patriarchy, designed women as the sexed, and to be kept in that position in the world through myth-making and push that to be the natural truth. This myth-making and truisms can easily be transitioned into television and film, and really any entertainment, but we're focusing on them, as part of the evolution to keep this bimodal force that benefits a monoculture. I feel the need to highlight my own male-bodied form here. I feel I shouldn't be lecturing people on this, so to make this clear, I am not immune to this conditioning and the myth-making of the perfect other and how they are formed by this culture. To demonstrate this, I want to use two anecdotes I personally had some blind spots I stopped to consider. The first of these involved, of all things, the movie Kingsman: The Secret Service. If you've never seen it, the film ends with a gag where a Swedish princess, out of nowhere, offers the main character anal if he saves her. When he saves the day and finishes all the, doing the whole good guy thing, there's a stinger right at the end of the film where he goes back and does that, and you don't see the whole thing, obviously, but you see the beginning of it. It's, it's a rather silly homage to how Bond movies end. This caused a controversy when it came out, and I was on the front saying that women shouldn't be depicted as dumb sex objects. The thing is, I had a friend replying to me saying she wanted women who are sexual, she wanted women who are not. She wants women who are revolted, weird, clumsy, you get the idea. And I never really thought of that. The whole thing about not having women be objectified can have a negative effect on having the woman have to be a certain mold, usually in a puritanical light. This fits into a very well-known feminine-based trope called the Madonna whore complex. That women can only be promiscuous or a good character, which is a really terrible way to broaden female perspective, no? And I mean, look, this joke isn't there to uplift women and to make them more diverse and complex. It's very laddish. Also, she becomes his girlfriend in the second movie, and she's really boring, lacking any personality. And surprised, she's not very sexual, likely as a reaction to this blowback, so. I have rewritten the story countless times. Now, I kept feeling it came off as me winning an intermittent argument years later, which isn't my point. But here goes my latest attempt. I watched a film before. What it is for here isn't relevant. And I felt really chuffed when I had a subplot where a bigger woman got with a skinnier guy. Then I felt it was me being condescending, and I wrote out how I felt about this. Thing is, I wrote it really stream of consciousness, and got accused of fat phobia, which, yeah, it did come off. I had issue with just seeing that type of relationship in general. I have friends who analyse fatness and culture who would have likely had strongly worded thoughts on my assishness. The other thing is, though, I felt really bothered by this because I am fat, and I've absolutely had the world treat me like shit because of my body. But someone said fat women and femmes deserve love too, and this honestly hit me. While I'm certainly judged for my weight, I'm not dehumanized like fat women and femmes are, especially when it comes to the romantic and sexual inclinations and attractions. Hell, fat men and skinny women being together is a sitcom trope. I sincerely do not mean for what I wrote to come off the way it did. I was trying to point out that it is a seriously normal relationship type, that for me to see it in media and praise it made me feel weird, because their sad reality is, it is uncommon in media, and sadly, it's judged in the way I was accused of. Especially after seeing this disgusting article talk about Nicola Coughlin's character getting into a relationship on Bridgerton. It is very unlikely that whoever I may have hurt with my poorly worded post are watching this, but I absolutely would not have just shot off what I wrote if I had that perspective. And for that, I do sincerely apologize. So to roll back to the point, women are designed to fit a certain role. And even trying to empower them seems to just double down on this role with meaningless aplomb. It feels more prioritized in writing a woman than making them feel fully fleshed out human feeling characters with dimensions. And yes, having their gender reflect on this experience in an honest way. What's the solution to this? Fuck if I know. And I mean, with a problem not only this systemic, but just flatly ingrained in our collective cultural experiences, I think pushing for a one-size-fits-all solution is not really the way to go. And even if there was one, I'm probably not the person to, come up with it or push it forward, because, the Beauvoir came to a conclusion that involves gender equality, but a way that women collectively push to be seen in a way that breaks down these social, physical, and psychological barriers and allows them to be seen past those fabrications.
Is it enough to change laws, institutions, customs, public opinion, and the whole social context for men and women to really become peers? Women will always be women, say the skeptics. Other seers prophesy that in shedding their femininity, they will not succeed in changing into men and will become monsters. This would mean that today's woman is nature's creation. It must be repeated again that within the human collectivity, nothing is natural, and woman, among others, is a product developed by civilization. Woman is defined neither by her hormones nor by mysterious instincts, but by the way she grasps, through foreign consciousnesses, her body and her relation to the world. The abyss that separates adolescent girls from adolescent boys was purposely dug out from early infancy. Later, it would be impossible to keep woman from being what she was made, and she will always trail this past behind her. If the weight of this past is accurately measured, it is obvious that her destiny is not fixed in eternity. This is why today's woman is torn between the past and the present. Most often, she appears as a real woman disguised as a man, and she feels as awkward in her woman's body as in her masculine garb. She has to shed her old skin and cut her own clothes. She will only be able to do this if there is a collective change. No one teacher can today shape a female human being that would be an exact homologue to the male human being. If raised like a boy, the young girl feels she is an exception, and that subjects her to a new kind of specification. Stendhal understood this, saying, "The forest must be planted all at once." But if we suppose, by contrast, a society where sexual equality is concretely realized, this equality would newly assert itself in each individual. If, from the earliest age, the little girl were raised with the same demands and honors, the same severity and freedom as her brothers, taking part in the same studies and games, promised the same future, surrounded by men and women who are unambiguously equal to her, the meanings of the castration complex and the Oedipus complex would be profoundly modified. The mother would enjoy the same lasting prestige as the father if she assumed equal material and moral responsibility for the couple. The child would feel an androgynous world around her and not a masculine world. Were she more effectively attracted to her father, which is not even certain, her love for him would be nuanced by a will to emulate him and not a feeling of weakness. She would not turn to passivity. If she were allowed to prove her worth in work and sports, actively rivaling boys, the absence of a penis, compensated for by the promise of a child, would not suffice to cause an inferiority complex. Correlatively, the boy would not have a natural superiority complex if it were not instilled in him and if he held women in the same esteem as men.
So the most obvious thing with this in mind is to get more women in the creative production side of film and television. And yes, this is a good thing that needs to be encouraged more. And we could be seeing a turn here with the likes of Greta Gerwig making a $1 billion earning movie. But you could probably infer that tends to just have a mostly male-run industry of Hollywood turn to tokenizing them and pigeonholing them into filming a certain mold. Like, they'll just be making doll movies or some shit. It's not a fix to the overall issue, though again, it should be encouraged and championed. Honestly, if there's any advice I can give about writing female characters and not risk falling into the pitfall of elevating them above a certain gender roles while unintentionally enforcing them, it's just to, write them. As mentioned, a woman can be sex-crazed, can be prudish, can be holier than thou, can be morally loose, can be shy, can be boisterous. The important thing is to figure out the humanity in them past the role. Hell, you can start that by writing a stock character and seeing how she evolves from the common mold, because it's a good basis to move from. A great example of this is Lola Bunny from the 2011 Looney Tunes show. Yeah, I totally get back to this. I mean, Lola starts off the show as this kind of fixated, overly attached girlfriend, which was a good punching bag from this time period. But she really doesn't stay like that. Hell, she doesn't really stay like that for long. Bugs grows to genuinely care for her, and they have a really fun, cozy dynamic. She becomes more than this role. A lot of the comedy around her doesn't come from her fixation on Bugs. It's usually her flightiness, impulsivity, and inability to think things through. It even ends up making her a good foil for Daffy on the show, who has a lot of similar qualities to her, though she's not as selfish and self-aggrandizing as he is. Their dynamic is really fun too. She's paired up with a new character, Tina, who's Daffy's love interest a few times, and they have a good contrasting dynamic as well. More importantly, she feels loony. She feels off the wall, larger than life in personality, which is really something sorely missing from a lot of her other depictions. She finally feels like she can be as wacky as dynamic as the rest of the cast. I don't really know how the creators of the show came to this, because I can't really find any interviews discussing her, though that doesn't mean that interviews aren't there. It just means I suck at research. I mean, if you find one, please link it to me. And part of this is there really isn't much to her to work from beforehand. Also, she was based on a pre-existing character being completely overhauled, so, history repeats. I mean, they could really do what they wanted, especially compared to other Looney Tunes characters who were overhauled in similar-ish ways, but nowhere near as drastically, because their personalities are way more defined. In the end, she became a fan favorite, and she's this really fun, likable character. So there we are! Video over. Please don't look at the progress bar. It's lying to you. I just left a blank screen. Yeah. Sincerely, if you want to hear the Lola stuff, that's pretty much done. I'm done talking about her. You can move on if that's all you cared about. I'm sure that's all the insights we can get into how the world looks at archetypes of women as well. After all, this topic is super frustrating, even for Beauvoir, as she puts in the intro of her book.
I hesitated a long time before writing a book on woman. The subject is irritating, especially for women, and it is not new. Enough ink has flowed over the quarrel about feminism. It is now almost over. Let's not talk about it anymore. Yet, it is still being talked about, and the volumes of idiocies churned out over this past century do not seem to have clarified the problem. Besides, is there a problem? And what is it? Are there even women? True, the theory of the eternal feminine still has its followers. They whisper, even in Russia, women are still very much women. But other well-informed people, and also at times those same ones, lament, woman is losing herself, woman is lost. It is hard to know any longer if women still exist, if they will always exist, if there should be women at all, what place they hold in this world, what place they should hold. Where are the women? Asked a short-lived magazine recently. But first, what is a woman?
Yeah, so I put transphobia in my content warning at the start, but I'm just going to reiterate this point again. The segment goes into some pretty heavy stuff, including me taking the perspective of a hypothetical gender critical person radicalizing themselves to make a point. If you cannot deal with that, which I completely understand, you can skip to the conclusion or just switch off the video now. If you chose the latter, thank you for watching. If you wish to continue with this part, let us do so. Hearing this discussion about women and how they're defined and what makes them and how media depicts them has influence, has a certain sting to it. Given recent discourses, especially using the term "what is a woman" in specific, it's a term used by transphobes to denigrate the validity of trans identities and to push the idea that cis women are somehow being erased. This was most famously popularized by Ambien Made Flesh and peddler of this fucking doll, Matt Walsh, in his documentary, well, What is a Woman? To go into this documentary and the bullshit itself is way too much for the scope of this video. I recommend Jesse Gender's excellent breakdown of it. So unclench the sphincters and don't think this is a video devaluing the premise of genders beyond the binary. Trite as it is to say, trans women are women, trans men are men, non-binary people are valid. And frankly, I think the Beauvoir's text validates these notions more than it doesn't. They are not here to destroy the concept of femininity. Trans women are inherently part of it. And in case this isn't clear, The Second Sex is a 75-year-old text. She has a lot of shitty thoughts in there, especially when it comes to race. It's important to consider feminist thought that followed her, especially when it comes to intersectionality. However, on the topic of being othered and controlled by narratives we are told via media and other sources around us and become our unquestioned reality, I think there's a lot here that doesn't just apply to how women are navigated. Let me go back to Trump and the slew of books and children's characters being cancelled after the January 6th riots. It's not unheard of a truism that it's harder to talk a person into a belief than it is to talk them out of it. That's usually because we are not beings of stone cold logic on our side. There's an emotionality to everything we hold valuable. And it takes a lot for you to break away from that emotional reality compared to a more factual one. I'm not lecturing you again, I am the same. I would hope if someone fairly and with reason explained why I was wrong on something, I would have the wisdom to listen. And I don't think this sling of right-wing outrage over fucking potato heads and Susan's books nobody read was that coincidental to being so soon after January 6th. While probably not as many Republicans turned on Trump as they should have, it definitely left a divide in the party that could be seen as dangerous to them. And this sounds dumb, right? You should laugh, big belly laugh. Ha ha ha. You're seriously saying people got so angry over Pepe Le Pew they remained loyal to Trump? How gauche, how silly. And it is. And I'm not saying there's a one-to-one connection here. What I am saying is not just loyalty to Trump, it's loyalty to a narrative. Fiction is powerful. People grew up with these iconic characters, or toys in one case. And we've seen with frightening certainty that dissatisfaction with stuff they grew up with, no matter why this is seen, when the simple answer can be just you're no longer ace, can very increasingly lead to way more dangerous indoctrination. Because once the nebulous dem destroys these figures you hold dear, what else are they working on? And if you don't know what I'm talking about, link somewhere. You can say this is ridiculous, you can say this is childish, but you cannot say that this isn't something people are earnestly invested in. You see Pepe Le Pew being removed because he's an antiquated joke. They see their very culture being erased for nefarious reasons. This very quickly leads to the scapegoats Trump builds his platform on. Immigration and the rich elite a millionaire is telling you are destroying your way of life. Because you notice something wrong. And there's a grain of truth there. But that truth can easily be hard pressed into a narrative blaming a lack of safety or economic insecurity on people weaker than you being empowered by the actual bad guys at Washington. And instead of examining powers or the structures that lead our lives, the solution is to take these structures and just give them to the guy promising to fix all your problems you have. Because it's a very comforting narrative that everything will be fine the way you've lived your life. Because that couldn't possibly have inevitably led to your plight if this one sneaky nefarious element didn't come in and ruin your good times. And this is the exact same shit we see with how the so-called gender criticals weaponize trans people. What is a woman? It's an important question, right? I think it's one worth asking as we navigate the toxic world we find ourselves often in when it comes to patriarchal notions. When nefarious and powerful men finding their way out of nefarious trouble, including what looks like Kevin Spacey making a comeback tour. Also all that shit that Trump just got away with recently thanks to the Supreme Court. It's something we need to bolster if women can have any power in this dynamic. So because these questions are inconvenient to certain dynamics, the idea that trans women are men
trying to trick others for sexual gratification, where trans men are women who are trying to hide from their feminine identity, it turns the ire downwards instead of upwards. It literalizes narratives around men even, to weaponize others' fear and ignorance. This becomes further incentivized with seemingly academic jargon and thought processes kicking in. Narratives that made the basis of TERFdom before it hit the mainstream have a lot of it in second wave feminism. Here's a really good video that looks into that. And it's worth noting that a lot of narratives and myths around trans women being predatory men are, pushed by film and television. If you want more insight into this, I would highly recommend checking out Disclosure. It's on Netflix. I just suggested like 4 different sources of information now in a row on this shit. Told you it was complicated. I'm not really here to go into the nitty gritty of all this. There are those way more qualified than I do. I want to talk about the simple truisms people tell themselves, convince themselves of these factors, and how they can be influenced by years, decades, hell, even centuries of social conditioning. I say this once again acknowledging I am at fault here as well. There's a shit ton of things I have to unlearn. I do this by listening to others when they express to me where I go wrong. And a lot of these people, well, they've helped me in ways they probably never realized they have. And the thing is that enough anymore? Is it enough to tell you where these people get their bigotries from? The US and the UK, two of the biggest economic footholds in what is nebulously referred to as the Western world, have major elections coming up. One of them is actually coming really soon in the UK, which is probably like done and dusted by the time I get this video out. And transphobia is at the center point of both of them. Republicans are using it to incentivize their base. Both major parties in the UK are platforming it. And while you look at the stats, while there are way too many people in the population egregious over trans people, the majority are still either supportive or don't really pay attention. But don't let that get in the way of a good yarn. It's a phantasm, as Judith Butler puts in their latest publication, Who's Afraid of Gender. I personally think they sum up this mindset of how effective it is of othering, in my own view, at least, very potently.
What is remarkable and disturbing is the way that this moral campaign relishes experimenting with various ways of denying the very existence of others, stripping them of their rights, refusing their reality, restricting basic freedoms, engaging in shameless forms of racial hatred, and controlling, demeaning, caricaturing, pathologizing, and criminalizing those lives. Hatred is stoked and rationalized by a moral righteousness, and all those damaged and destroyed by hateful movements are cast as their truer agents of destruction. These projections and reversals structure the phantasmic sense of gender. This leaves us with 2 urgent questions. Who is out to destroy whom? And how do forms of shared and escalating moral sadism pass themselves off as a virtuous order?
Good questions. Are we reaching a point where certain women are being elevated to subject? Or more accurately, are they being led to believe so? This is just broader picture stuff, right? Let's look at something more insular. You're someone who has witnessed or been victim to the rampant, encroaching misogyny that surrounds you. All you see are rapists who get off prison or murders done frequently. Maybe it's domestic violence that gets swept under the rug because he's not the type. Maybe it's fucking minor things, like women are talked down to for saying the same thing men do, or they get paid more for the equivalent amount of work. Doesn't matter, it's everywhere. It's been out there your whole life. Women are taught the duty of care is on them. They should be kept safe, they should be wary of every man they witness. It's infuriating, it's exhausting, and it is constant. Suddenly, you start seeing trans women coming into the media out of nowhere. Maybe the first time you've ever come across a trans person is Caitlyn Jenner. And I mean girls same, I'd be sick of two, but for completely different reasons. It's odd to you, right? Men are men and women are women. How can someone born a man opt into being a woman? Well, you're told in fairness they have dysphoria and this helps them with their mental health. Fine. You're sympathetic to that. But the few rights in your eyes that women get are now with trans women they're being acclimated to. Like sports, you know, all the famous trans athletes like ... They're in women's bathrooms? They're in women's prisons now? That doesn't seem safe. As we have seen, throughout history, the role of women has been redefined to subjugate to men. So in a small way, I understand the knee-jerk reaction that comes from this. And this is where my sympathies begin, and this is where they end. Because the second they use your fear to rationalize that people are misguided in their gender identity, you do not only pull yourself back into a patriarchal view of how bimodal gender roles should function, you do so at the behest of the safety of a marginalized group for the sake of your own comfort. You enable violence, and nothing you will say make that okay. Fuck you. But we're not done, are we? Because while I'm not sympathetic to these people, saying that won't turn their heads away. Because they're not the only ones saying it. Famous people, you know the ones, and politicians are saying it too. Look at all these people sharing their fears. And they're being shouted at and being called transphobic for just asking questions. Because you've seen trans people, they're all over the telly. They're men in dresses who are delusional assaulters, perverts. They want kids to do this. Oh no, where does this madness end? You are told your whole life that men are inherently dangerous and will do anything to assault women. You think they will stop at calling themselves a woman and wearing a dress? Suddenly the worry you don't see other people sharing turns into genuine panic and paranoia. You see it everywhere, starts to consume you. Suddenly you start seeing yourself on the side of anti-abortionists. Yeah, Kurds seem to get really comfortable with Catholic right, don't they? Because it doesn't matter. We need to stop the madness. Things need to go back to normal. You know what reality is. You know what was told to you. Women are weak, they're defenseless, they're pathetic and everything compared to men. They want to usurp us because that's all that men do. You start following these men who want to remove the rights of women. You don't put your faith in women but in men. Men with machine minds and machine hearts. Men that work in a language that machines know best. A binary one. Suddenly right-wing politicians start saying stuff you agree with. It doesn't matter what they said before made you ill in the past. It matters that they're talking rationally. You need someone to tell you you're not the only one going crazy. You saw the fast idea of gender socially constructed since the dawn of time. And rather than accept that women's pain and frustration was possibly made by something forged, you stepped on trans women to keep your mind clear. This is what men are. This is what women will always be. You'll step on trans women and you'll step on cis women too. You'll step on all women. Because you think they'll stop here? You think the encroaching talks of demonizing queerness and spilling into the B's and the G's and the L's, groups you may be a part of, is a fucking coincidence? You pushing sexual deviance isn't just a ploy to push it forward? When this trans moral panic happened, Roe v. Wade was overturned and none of these fucking caring about women people said anything. You don't think that the Catholic right won't use this as a wedge issue to put the subjugation of women's bodies, their autonomy, on the patriarchal roles they need to play. But that's fine. That's alright. As long as you stay comfortable. As long as you feel safe. Because you cannot accept the fact that answers to questions about femininity are more complicated than you want them to believe. Abandon any principle or at some point any notion that you're doing this for fear of women's safety and identity. And say it in the blood that pours into the ocean you are a drop of, because we are finally back to sanity. So yeah, I hope you asked the question, what is a woman? Because you won't be able to sometime soon. Hey, how are you keeping? Are you doing well? I'm doing fucking amazing, as you can see. One of the prevailing truisms you usually see with people who bring up the phenomenon of the fact that, you know, more trans people are identifying now than they used to be, is to bring up the phenomenon of left-handedness, that more left-handed people became more comfortable to identify as being left-handed as time has gone on. And a lot of this is happening because, you know, left-handedness stopped being a stigma. While there are countries that still have this stigmatization, the ones that the trans debates are raging in, emphasis on rage, it's largely seen as, you know, erased and kind of nonsense if you try to judge people on that ground. But this is a more recent thing. Hell, the stigma was still around when I was in primary school. I'm 34. And I mean, the discourse around women's roles, misogyny, transphobia, it's a lot larger than a left hand. The magical behind the scenes. I fixed the frame so it would look better. And eventually I will fix my hair to do the same. Bad hair. We talked about stigma surrounding women and their place in the world, and it never seems to end. And this has a bleed-on effect of how much it hurts trans people, not only holding on to this binary, but demonizing them as male predators, or escaping their gender, or something if they're transmasculine. But it's important to know we've been fighting these battles, you know, to struggle against these stigmas and these stereotypes and these myths that have, you know, been around women for generations, for the millennia even, for about roughly 200 years. It's not that long a time. And to act like there's been no progress made since the Beauvoir's time, it does a lot of disservice for a lot of great people who made a lot of strides. The video initially was going to end with that rant, but I felt it was a disservice to do it because it ended on such a hopeless note. I may not be influential, but I want to leave a positive influence. But this one, I don't know. I can say wait 100 years and things will be grand. But that won't bring back those who have died waiting to be accepted for who they are, will it? Telling those on a knife's edge, it may sooner get better, will not take them off that edge. And I don't want to lie to them. Well, I do if it keeps them around, but it would feel insincere. We've seen progress walked back. A lot. And it's terrifying. And you're allowed to feel terrified. You're valid in that terror. But if nothing else, you will leave a world that adores you for you. Even if you struggle in society using your identity as political cudgel or a spectre of evil. If there's anything we can do as allies, or those who are in this shit without a shovel, well, the media you make matters. And that goes beyond the prohibitive avenues of film and television. It is important to get more trans creatives in those fields. I mean, I saw the TV Glow came out recently and that's doing really well. There are people who have felt seen and hell possibly kept alive by people they see on social media. Trans people living their best lives, pushing out their work. I'm seeing trans folks on YouTube making films and showing to those that they are valid, they can thrive, they belong here. But I mean, with everything going on, with the way that the media landscape and its influence, because a handful of ghouls are getting their claws into set streams of influence, maybe it's too difficult to keep that positivity flowing. Maybe there was never any hope. Just a fool's hope. Okay, that's going back to being unhelpful. A lot of this essay is about media's reflection on us and how it can help us be uplifted and change the conversations around marginalized people and how they can be seen. Let's end with another quote from a very influential series, one I referenced just a few seconds ago. So much so that our former fucking Taoiseach quoted this very speech. The reason I think you should go on is there's good in this world. And it's worth fighting for. Even darkness must pass.